Hello everyone, and welcome to my talk on resource depletion and recovery in human memory. As you all know, human memory is severely limited, either in terms of its total capacity, when we talk about short-term memory, or in terms of the amount of information that can be stored in it within any given period of time when we talk about long-term memory. So the basic question that I'm going to address today is, what is the mechanism responsible behind these limitations in human memory? A number of alternatives have been proposed to explain these limitations, and I'm not going to focus on all of them today. I will specifically discuss the idea that storing information in memory depends on a limited cognitive resource. This idea is old, and as with any old idea, it has various different formulations. The resource in question has been conceived as limits on the total amount of activation in the memory system, as limits on the amount of attentional control that people can exercise, as limits on the number of slots in memory, or as limited abstract quantity, physiological or psychological, that gets depleted with use. Despite these differences, all resource-based theories share a number of core assumptions, which are that some kind of a limited psychological or physiological quantity is required for fueling cognitive operations. And crucially, using this quantity for one process leaves less of it for performing additional processes. And finally, we assume that the amount of resources used up to fuel the process determines either its success, its efficiency, or the speed with which it is performed. In addition to these ubiquitous features, another feature shared by most, although not all, resource-based theories is that once a process is completed, the resource can be used immediately for something else. As an example, consider slot models of working memory in which each item is assigned to a particular slot. Usually in these models, once the information is no longer relevant for our behavior goals, it can be offloaded, and these slots can be immediately used for storing new information. So this assumption that cognitive resources become immediately available for use is ubiquitous in current memory models, but has never actually been tested. And there exists a model, the source of activation confusion, or SAC model, developed originally by Lynn Reeder, that incorporates the assumption that cognitive resources actually recover gradually over time. In kind of a simple analogy to muscle operations, muscles require fuel in the form of ATP molecules to function, and these molecules can be generated at a slow rate over time, and you cannot perform novel contractions until they do so. So the goal of my dissertation project was to test these two assumptions of the model. Does memory formation depend on a limited resource that recovers gradually over time? There were multiple specific aims of this dissertation, but today I will focus on two particulars. First, I will show that using these assumptions, the model can provide a very comprehensive account of what were previously considered puzzling findings about the effects of frequency, presentation rate, list composition, age, etc. on long-term and short-term memory. And second, I will show that due to the gradually recovering resource assumptions, the model makes novel risky predictions, which we tested and confirmed in several studies. So let's start with the first part. So most of the findings that I'm going to talk about today briefly concern the effect of word frequency on memory. So as you know, words differ in terms of the frequency in which they appear in natural language. So for example, consider these two words, chair and rogue. Chair is a much more high frequency word. And the reason why word frequency is interesting is because it's one of the variables that has extremely diverse and puzzling effects on memory. Word frequency sometimes can lead to better memory for high frequency words, and it can sometimes lead to worse memory for high frequency words, depending on the particular conditions of the procedure. And in fact, so we've done a literature review on this. The direction, whether the effect of frequency is positive or negative, and the absolute size of the effect size of the frequency effect depend on a number of factors, such as the type of test, whether it's recall, which leads to a positive effect of word frequency, or recognition, which leads to a negative effect. It also depends on the list composition, whether each memory list contains only high or only low frequency words, or whether these are mixed together, which causes the effects of frequency to disappear. It also depends on the specific order of high and low frequency items within a list. The effects get bigger or smaller as we change the presentation rate, but again depending on the type of test. The effects get bigger with subsequent serial positions, and the effects also tends to increase as we increase the memory load. In fact, this brief summary that I just gave you of frequency effect is a big simplification of the various effects in the literature. And so this presents an extreme challenge for a model of memory to account for all of the positive and negative effects depending on different conditions. And models exist for different subsets of these findings, but up until now, no model has tried to account for all frequency effects, positive and negative, in all of these different tasks, which was the first goal of mine. So let's go over the assumptions of the SAC model that help explain these effects. First assumption is that forming or strengthening new memory traces and operations such as binding stimuli to context depletes a limited pool of memory resources. The assumption is that each memory operation depletes a certain proportion of that resource pool, and that resource in turn replenishes over time. Crucially for word frequency effects, however, is that the proportion of resources required to encode a memory trace depends on its current strength in memory. Weaker stimuli, such as low frequency items, require more resources for their processing, and as such, they leave fewer resources available for doing additional operations, such as binding them to context, to other stimuli, or to processing subsequent items. And a final assumption is that retrieval involves contextual competition. So things that have been experienced more frequently, such as high frequency words, are associated to more context, and it's more difficult to retrieve any specific one of these contexts. Based on these assumptions, there are two key insights here to understand how frequency effects occur. Basically, there is a trade-off between what we call a high-frequency encoding advantage, which is that high-frequency words require less resources to be processed and as a result have stronger bindings, and also low-frequency retrieval advantage, because low-frequency words have less associations in memory and are more effective in retrieving any one of them. So whether we would observe a positive or a negative effect of word frequency would depend on the trade-off between these two factors, and that trade-off can be described in a systematic way depending on the nature of the retrieval demands. But also, more importantly, because of the resource recovery assumption, any condition that changes either the total amount of resources in the system or how much time there is between recovery operations could shift the encoding advantage to be stronger and more dominant. I will skip over the computational details. I'm happy to answer more questions about them later, but in the interest of time, so suffice to say that we've modeled all of these effects and we have really good fits of the model, and the model successfully captures most of these. And the interesting thing to note here is that based off of modeling these 18 studies, we've estimated that the resource takes about 5 seconds to fully recover, and our estimate is between 2 and 12 seconds. So accounting for existing puzzles is great, and this is the first model to do it in such a comprehensive manner, but the true test of a model is the ability to make novel, risky predictions that can be confirmed in subsequent experiments, and that's exactly what we did as the next step. So consider a list memory experiment in which a participant studies a number of items, and we're particularly interested for memory for item in position K. As a result of the resource recovery assumptions, we can make the prediction that memory for item in position K would depend on how much resources were depleted by the preceding items xk-1, xk-2, etc. In particular, we can make 6 different predictions about the order of the items. First, memory for an item xk will be worse if the preceding item required more resources, in this case if it's a low frequency item. Second, this effect should be proportional to the strength of the preceding items, so as the frequency of the preceding item gradually increases, memory for the current item should also get better due to having more resources available. Third, these effects should be cumulative, such that if we have more low-frequency items in a sequence before the current item, memory for the current item should be even worse because more resources would have been depleted. There should also be an interaction between the strength of the current item and the preceding item, such that weaker current items would exhibit even bigger sequential study effects. Finally, there should be also an interaction between the lag between the current and the previous item, such that items further back in the sequence would have less of an effect. And finally, this effect should also interact with the presentation rate, because speeding up the presentation rate would allow less time for resources to recover between presentations. So we've tested these predictions in 9 different studies, and we've tested them as a function not only of word frequency, which is low versus high, either discrete or continuous, but we've also tested as a function of experimentally training pseudo-word frequency. We've tested it also as the number of repetitions in an experiment, which would also strengthen memory traces, and we've also tested it as a function of explicitly instructing people how likely it is that some items would be tested. And we found overall overwhelming support for all of these assumptions. Due to time limitations, I'll just give you one example. This is from a directives for getting study that we did with colleagues in Germany, in which we asked people to study a list of words, and after each individual word, we gave them a cue whether the words should be forgotten or remembered for a subsequent memory test. And the assumption here is that people would spend more resources encoding the words that are to be remembered, which means that memory for the words that follow to be remembered words should be worse because there are less resources available. And this is exactly what we found here. On the y-axis we have cued recall accuracy, and on the x-axis we have instructions for the current item. So not surprisingly, items that people were taught to remember have a much better memory, which is the classical directed forgetting effect. But crucially, and this is the lower line here, items that followed the to be remembered item actually had much worse memory than items that followed the to be forgotten items in memory. This effect was cumulative, which is the other prediction that I said. So here on the x-axis we have the number of either to be forgotten on the left or to be remembered items on the right. So we go from 3 to be forgotten, 2 to be forgotten, up to 3 to be remembered items in a sequence. And we see that the more to be remembered items in a sequence there are, the worse memory is for the current item. And the dotted lines are the fits of the as well. And we've replicated this effect and discounted a number of alternative explanations. And crucially, the final prediction that I wanted to show you here is the interaction between lag and instructions. So here on the x-axis we have the position of the preceding item relative to the current item. So a lag of 2 means that we are looking for instructions for the item that appears 2 positions back. And we see that when the immediately preceding item was to be remembered, we have a much bigger impairment for the memory for the current item relative to as we increase the lag, this effect gets smaller and smaller, and this is because more time was available for resources to recover. And we've shown that with word frequency and other variables, as I noted. So as a summary, the model successfully provided a comprehensive account of what was previously considered various puzzling findings, and it also made several novel risky predictions that were confirmed in several experiments. Thank you for your attention.